Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay, hello, thanks very much for coming to this RTC event on social mobility. We're very pleased to have Professor Richard Breen. Richard is a professor of sociology at Oxford University and a Fellow of Nuffield College. He's also a member of the British Academy. And he's edited several comparative studies of social mobility across Europe and the US. And his new book is Education and Intergenerational Social Mobility. And as the title suggests, it's about the role of education in fostering social mobility. So over to you, Professor Breen. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak here. So today I'm going to talk about this book, Education and Intergenerational Mobility, Social Mobility in Europe and the United States. And I'm going to try and summarize some of the main findings from it. This isn't just my own work. This is an edited collection. And my co-editor was Walter Müller, who's at the University of Mannheim. And we had contributors who wrote about many of the different countries there. The book as a whole deals with those countries, 7 European countries and the United States. You can see it doesn't deal with Britain. I should explain that when I wrote this book, or in the process of writing that book, I was at Yale, so there was no compelling reason to want to include Britain in the book. But today I'm just going to focus on 5 countries, because I think, as you'll see, the graphs are going to have lots of lines on them. They would have had even more lines on them if I had looked at all of the countries. So let me explain what we did then. We compared the mobility of men and women in these countries, and we tried to get a picture of what had happened over the 20th century, which is surprisingly rare in studies of intergenerational mobility. So we divided our data into these 6 birth cohorts, so people born between 1925, on average they were born around 1915. And then we had 10-year birth cohorts, and then we had another cohort post-1964. And on average, they were born around 1970. So we're really talking about what happened to intergenerational mobility for people born between about 1915 and 1970. What we did was we took survey data sets from all of these countries, most of which are actually just cross-sectional. But we identified the birth cohorts then in those data. So for some of the birth cohorts, we had multiple observations of them at different ages. In fact, for all of them, I think we had multiple observations. So we focus on people aged either between 30 and 35 and either between 65 or 70, so that the class position that they're in can really be assumed to be something that they're going to stay in for the rest of their lives. So we wanted them to have reached occupational maturity. And that's quite reasonable, I think, for these birth cohorts. It might be less reasonable for more recent birth cohorts. We're looking at class mobility. So we are using 7 social classes that come out of the Erickson-Goldthorpe class framework. So Goldthorpe has been using this class classification in various forms since the 1970s. It's what has informed the development of NSSEC. So these are very close to being NSSEC categories. And you can see what the 7 categories are. And a lot of the story today is going to be about those top 2 classes, about what happened to them over the 20th century and how things changed. I should say, I mentioned earlier that there hadn't been a whole lot of research on trends over the 20th century in intergenerational mobility. One of the reasons for that is, of course, it's not really possible to do that if you're interested in intergenerational income mobility, because we don't have data that goes back that far, right? So even in Sweden, you can't really get income data for people born before about 1950. The nice thing about this is that people in these surveys are asked about their parents' occupations, and from that we can put them into social classes. So, and that makes a lot of sense. We actually did some work some years ago looking at how reliable that was. And in fact, people's responses to their parents' occupations, when they are put into social classes, are highly reliable. And of course, the same wouldn't be true if you asked people about their parents' income or their parents' earnings. So if you want to look at these long-term trends, then this is almost the only way. Looking at occupations, and particularly social classes, seems to be almost the only way you can do it. Okay, we're going to make then the usual distinction in what follows between absolute and relative mobility. So absolute mobility is just measuring how many people move between origins in one class and destination in another class. But relative mobility then is a comparison of how people from different origins differ in the distribution of the classes that they get into. So it's usually thought of as capturing equality of opportunity or societal openness. So if relative mobility is high, your social origins have a weaker effect on where you end up than if relative mobility is low. It's usually measured by odds ratios. I'm probably not going to say too much about them, but large odds ratios mean low social fluidity. So we want small odds ratios. And the less preliminary thing to say is we're going to compare trends across countries, not the absolute level across countries. So we're not going to say that Sweden is more socially fluid than France, which it is, but that's not what we're going to say in this study. What we're interested in this study is not comparing levels, but looking at trends and seeing how they've been the same or have been different in different countries. So if we begin with absolute mobility, these are the 5 countries. So Germany in black, France blue, Sweden in green, the Netherlands in yellow, and the US in red. And this is the distribution of people in the top and the bottom classes over these birth cohorts. And you can see that there's a pretty clear picture. This is just for men. You can see that there's this growth of people in the top classes, which then more or less comes to an end around cohorts born in the 50s, except for that one case, which is the Dutch case, which is a bit unusual. Conversely, at the bottom, you can see that the unskilled manual classes were declining, also up to about the 1950s, and then that flattens out again. And if we look at women, the picture is similar, but not quite the same. There does seem to be a bit of an inflection point around the 1945-54 cohort, but the flattening out isn't quite as pronounced. There's still some growth after that. And the decline in the manual classes, you can see that at the beginning of the century, those women who had a job were very heavily concentrated down at the bottom of the class structure. But they improved their position markedly. But again, there's some sort of flattening out for the later born cohorts. And then if we translate that into upward and downward mobility, we see a very similar picture, which is that upward mobility for men increases up to the mid-century, and then it decreases. So more recent born cohorts have less upward mobility than the earlier cohorts, and downward mobility is moving in the opposite direction, as again you might have anticipated. The picture for women is a little different. Again, it increases, upward mobility increases, but then it more or less flattens out, and downward mobility declines, but it more or less flattens out. The reason I think for the difference between men and women in these things is that women were increasingly moving into occupations that they hadn't been in the early part of the century. So this means that the structural changes that were driving the changes for men, they were also driving the changes for women. But you can think of another structural change for women, which was the availability of jobs, especially at the top of the class structure, that hadn't been available before. So that makes their trend a little bit more favourable than the trend for men. Then this is relative mobility. So really, you don't need to know what OD unidifs means. But this is a measure of the strength of association between origins and destinations. So for every country, we norm it by starting it at 1. So as this line goes down, origins are having less of an impact on where people end up. And you can see that for men, it's almost exactly the same pattern as for relative mobility. In other words, things are improving up to the cohorts born around the middle of the century, and from then on, there's really very little change. Okay. It's important to stress there's really no change. It's not that things have got necessarily worse. It's not that things have got worse. Right? Things have just not changed. And the picture for women is pretty similar. So Germany is a bit of a short line here because we don't have enough working women in these early cohorts to be able to plot that. But again, you see that the pattern is reasonably similar. They're again a little bit more favourable, I would say, for women. So the bottom line here really is that absolute and relative mobility patterns have really mirrored one another. So increasing rates of upward mobility have gone hand in hand with increasing equality of opportunity. And when that upward mobility flattened out, so did the trends in equality of opportunity. If we look at education then, since one of the things that we were interested in was looking at how education affected these trends, or how it was related to these trends. Well, we categorized education. In the chapters dealing with each country, education is measured much more finely, but in order to compare, we just ended up with 3 categories of education: elementary, a middle category, and then tertiary. But this is, of course, a very, very familiar picture, which is declining shares of the population in elementary education. I mean, if you look at France at the beginning of the century, almost everybody was in elementary education, which means that they were getting really no more than primary education, if that. But by the post-1965 cohort, it's come down drastically, and of course that's continued. And this trend of more tertiary has also continued, because when you look at these birth cohorts, you see that we got 40% of them in Sweden and the Netherlands in our most recent cohort have tertiary education. But if you look at the OECD figures, I mean, the OECD average now is above 50% of each birth cohort in tertiary education.
Sorry, can I just check I'm understanding that elementary one right?
Well, yeah.
So are you saying that there are less people
Without
school age that are in primary level education?
This is when people complete their education. So these are people who are completing their education with no more than elementary, which means what I said it means. Yeah, this is completion. And this is the same picture for women, and of course the growth in tertiary education for women has been a little bit more marked than it has for men in the more recent birth cohorts. So this is something that isn't the same trend as we've been seeing so far, right? Because this trend has pushed on throughout the 20th century. But if we look at how much social origins affect educational attainment, then we're back to something that looks more like the previous picture. So again, social origins had less and less of an effect on educational attainment of people up until we get to the mid-century, and from then on, much less change, but actually with some suggestion that it may have strengthened again a little bit in some countries. So this line begins to go up again in 1 or 2 places. We have to be cautious, I think, in interpreting that, because of the way our data are constructed, most of our observations are for the middle cohorts, and we have fewer observations in the extreme cohorts. Nevertheless, even if you compute the standard errors of these things, this is a significant trend upwards. This is the same picture for women. Same kind of trend, I think you can see. So what's kind of remarkable about all of this is first of all, that all the countries are showing very, very similar patterns. So although these countries have had, quite different policies, so if you think about policies in tertiary education, the US policy has been quite different, say, from the German policy or the Swedish policy. Labour market regulations are very different across these countries, but still we're seeing these very similar trends. This is just another way of showing where this kind of inflection point comes. So instead of breaking it up into birth cohorts, What we did here was we made moving averages. So these are moving averages centered on people born to begin with in 1921. So that would be people born from 1917 to 1925, then people born 1918 to 26, and so on, right up to people born, I think it's 63 to 71. And the solid line is the social fluidity between origins and destinations, and the dashed line is the effect of social origins on education. And you can see that, at least for Swedish men, the point at which it all stopped getting better was about the late 1940s. After that, it's all pretty constant. These lines, you can't compare the where they are in the graph. It doesn't mean to say that this was weaker than this. Right? You can only compare the trends. And this is the picture for women. So you can see the big improvement for women, but then it flattens out, and then there's this suggestion that we saw earlier, actually, that maybe for Swedish women things are getting a little bit worse in later cohorts. So just to summarize, we've got our two kinds of mobility, absolute and relative, and they're really going in the same way, and the distinction is people born before the 1950s, roughly speaking, and people born after. So for those born before, upward mobility was increasing, downward mobility was declining, social fluidity was increasing, and social origins were having less and less of an impact on your education. After the 1950s, it's slightly different for men and women. For men, upward mobility decreases, downward increases. The OD association doesn't change, and the OE association doesn't really change. And for women, the relative mobility is the same as pattern is the same as men, but really there's not a huge amount of change then in upward and downward mobility for those later cohorts. So there are some small differences between men and women, but generally the patterns are rather similar. Okay, it doesn't include Great Britain, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, but my colleague Colin Mills put together some data that allows us to see, is this trend in equality of opportunity, is it the same in Britain? Well, the answer is it does indeed seem to be pretty much the same. So there are two data sets here that he's used. A general household survey, which uses the old census socioeconomic groups to define classes. And then there's a bunch of other surveys like Understanding Society and various other things that use NSSEC. So this first series only goes up to there, so that's 1953 to 57. So that's really capturing the period when things were improving, equality of opportunity was increasing. This overlaps a bit, it's a little bit different here, I'm not sure why, but this is very clearly flat in this period as well. So it does look like this 1950s birth cohort watershed is also true of Britain as well. We didn't have time to do the same thing for women, but I would be very surprised if the trend was not similar for them. Okay, so what was really driving all this? Well, I think what it was being driven by. Well, we know in fact what the increasing equality of opportunity was being driven by, and it was being driven by the growth of the top two classes, classes 1 and 2, which are usually called the service class or the salariat. And this grew in destinations, that's the top line in these figures, and it also grew in social origins. So essentially what was happening over the 20th century is that more and more men were entering the top classes. All the other classes throughout the 20th century have declined in number, or declined in the proportion for men. So there was this growth in those classes over the century. And then a little bit later, those classes began to grow in origins as well. So initially there was a bit of a gap between the two. It's perhaps clearer for Sweden here. You can see that the gap in the proportion of men who originated in classes 1 and 2 and the proportion who ended up in classes 1 and 2 gets wider, and then it begins to narrow. And the reason for that is, of course, that the people who are the respondents born in the early cohorts are actually the people, not specifically the people, but they are from the same birth cohorts as the people who were the parents for the people born in these cohorts. So what was happening was that there was increasing room at the top over this period, but that room at the top then began to diminish later in the century, and it diminished for two reasons. One is that if more and more people are starting out at the top, which was the consequence of the expansion of the classes at the top in the early part of the century, if more and more people are starting at the top, then of course there's going to be, all things equal, less room then at the top. And the other thing was, of course, that a lot of this was driven by big structural changes that occurred particularly after the war. And that was a kind of a one-off period phenomenon. And when that played out, then of course room at the top was becoming less. So you can see these lines, they diverge, but then they converge. So one of the consequences of that is, of course, that people who start out being born into the top classes nowadays have a lower chance of remaining in the top classes. But also, people who are not born into those classes have a lower chance of getting into them. So, in a sense, both groups are unhappy compared with what would have been the case for earlier born cohorts. And this kind of difference between the sort of room at the top and the demand for those places at the top, you can see it in the ratio between the destinations in the top two classes and the proportion of people who have tertiary education. So in the first cohort, there are way more places in the top two classes than there are people who have tertiary education. But in the last cohort, which is the lighter blue lines, the ratio is about 1. So in other words, if you wanted to fill the top two classes for people, in the early cohorts, you didn't have to have tertiary education because there was such an oversupply of places. But now, if you take a country like France or Sweden, you're most unlikely to get into them without tertiary education. So the opportunities kind of diminished. This is the same picture for women, so I'm not going to walk you through it because it's very much the same pattern. Here you see for Germany this widening and then a narrowing again. And here's the same ratio of class 1 to 2 destinations to tertiary education. I mean, this is huge. The dark blue is huge for women, and that's of course because very few women were getting tertiary education at that period. The effect of this has meant that the odds of we got more equality of opportunity simply because the growth of these classes at the top, when they were growing, it meant that families who were in those classes, their children could remain in those classes, but there was still plenty of availability of places in those classes for children who were born in families that were in lower social classes. And essentially this is what we are trying to show here. So let's look at the Swedish case. This is the odds of someone who was born into the top class staying in the top class. And that didn't change. What did change was the odds of someone who wasn't born into the top class getting into it. And that improved, but it improved up to that point, and then it remained constant. And that's the same picture, I think, in all of the countries, and it's the same picture for women. Okay, so what was going on here? Well, over the course of the century, there was this gradual occupational upgrading, but it received a huge boost after the Second World War for this 30-year period when we had this massive expansion of jobs at the top of the class structure. And that this has affected absolute mobility is, I think, quite widely known. Right? Certainly for Britain, we know that the big boost to absolute mobility came about because of this rapid period of growth that ended in the early 1970s. But what is also the case is that equality of opportunity changed at the same time. It improved at the same time. So the question then is, did education play any role in this at all? Or was it all just down to the structural change that was occurring in the economies of these countries? Well, this is just plotting. We saw this actually for the Swedish men on the moving averages, but this is just plotting the association between origins and destinations and origins and education. And you can see they follow each other quite closely. And there's the picture for women. And then this is just this is the proportion of, the dotted line is the proportion of people who have less than tertiary education. So that's going down at the same time that the association between origins and destinations is going down. So it looks like there's a relationship between social fluidity and education, as well as between social fluidity and educational fluidity. Same picture for women. And if you just plot them, which is what we did here, so this is the Origin Education Association against the Origin Destination Association for all the birth cohorts in our data across all of the countries. And I mean, there does seem to be some kind of a relationship. And the same thing here with the proportion of people with tertiary education. It's quite closely related to the Origin Destination Association, and the same thing for women. Okay, so basically what the story is I think this is really only going to summarize what I said. That there's this tale of two halves, really. People born before 1950, people born after 1950. For those born after 1950, the thing that was driving a lot of the growth in mobility was the growth of destinations at the top. And since that didn't grow as much, and you had more and more people coming from origins at the top, it meant the service class was becoming more self-recruiting and also more difficult for people to be upwardly mobile into. And the pattern of education is rather similar. And then for fluidity, again, the increasing fluidity was mostly due to more equal access to classes 1 and 2. One thing, of course, that this did bring about was a big decline in differences between men and women. So this is the mobility rate difference, percent men minus percent women in, for example, upward mobility. So this is generally declining over time. So they're getting more similar. And this begins negatively because at the beginning of the century, women had more downward mobility than men, and that's moving up. So one of the things that has happened, of course, is a male-female convergence, though it's not perhaps as good as this shows, because the service class is the top 2 classes, and women tend to be clustered in the lower of those 2 classes, whereas men tend to be more in the top. So this picture's a little bit obscuring some of what has been going on. So we've seen that these are very consistent results. I should say that the other countries we looked at, Italy follows the same pattern. Interestingly, Spain follows exactly the same pattern, but it all happens about 20 years later. And the reason for that is, of course, Spain never had the big post-war boom, but it did have a big boom starting in the 1970s that carried on then after the demise of Franco and lasted on into the 90s. So essentially all the patterns that I've shown you today for Spain are just shifted forward 20 years. It's difficult to disentangle the role of education from the role of structural change, even though the education effect does seem to be robust to controls for structural change and upward mobility and so on. But I think our argument really about what happened in the 20th century is that the greater openness of education that occurred during the first part of the century really paid off during the post-war expansion of higher level jobs. Because the supply of those jobs was such that middle-class families couldn't themselves fill them all, so there didn't need to be a decline in their chances to allow more people to come from outside. So there was no kind of zero-sum constraint there. But the chances of people from outside the service class were improved by virtue of the fact that they had better levels of education than they would have done otherwise. So we feel that what's really been happening here is that these structural change and educational change have been actually operating together to bring about these changes. Not so much in absolute mobility, but more in relative mobility. Okay, that is a picture of the book. I think I've more or less said what I want to say, but if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to try to address them. And if you want to know anything more about any of the details of any of the countries that we looked at, well then, that's all in the book.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Breen. We got about half an hour for questions, and as usual, the chair hogs the opportunity for the first one.
Okay.
So I would do that, following in Ian's tradition. So it seems that it's a combination of what's going on here is a combination of this changing economic and labour market structure, which we can't really do very much about, certainly in the short and medium term. But also what's going on are sort of changing educational opportunities, which we probably can do something about. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, but also about the fact that there seems to be, from your research, the numbers, there seems to be a sort of diminishing returns from extra education, which seems to be possibly what we're experiencing at the moment. So if you simply enlarge the number of people going into higher education, you end up with a completely different form of stratification. So it's not necessarily anymore to have a degree, it's about where it's from. It's got to be the Russell Group, or it's got to be Oxbridge, or it's got to be a master's or something. So can you say a bit more about how much further we can go with just improving education?
Yes, so I mean, in our data, we start at the beginning of the 20th century. And so that was the time when about 2/3 of the population of many of these countries didn't actually progress beyond some either primary level or just 1 or 2 years of secondary. So those reforms that occurred in those years, let's say, or before the middle of the century, were things like increasing the minimum school leaving age, making it more easy to get to secondary schools by, for example, removing fees that people would have hitherto had, by building more schools so they were more accessible and so on. But all of those reforms were affecting a group in society which was the classes down at the bottom. And it benefited them disproportionately because the other classes, they were already doing all that stuff, right? So these reforms inevitably advantaged the people at the bottom. And so this is why you see the association between origins and education weakens as you see more people from working class backgrounds and farming backgrounds particularly getting higher levels of qualification. So then, of course, there's the question of, well, how does that transfer to today? Well, now it's a very different situation, right? Because we've been gone from a situation in which we've got like 60 or 65% with very little education to a case where we've got 50% with tertiary education. And we don't also have the prospect of having big structural changes. I had this in a previous presentation, but I mean, this is the stuff about structural changes. I'll just get out of the way. A paper by John Goldthorpe and Michelle Jackson that they're basically saying it's not going to happen again. So in that case, I think whatever changes you're going to see in education, you're not going to get as big a bang for your buck as you did from the changes there. So the changes that education can make are going to be marginal, right? At least relative to what we've just seen. So in a way, I always think that justifying sort of educational policy in terms of what it's going to do for social mobility is probably a mistake. I mean, I think you should justify it in terms of, well, it's a good thing, right? I mean, it's a good thing for equality of opportunity. It may have effects on social mobility, but I don't think we can expect to see very big effects on social mobility, if by social mobility you mean the macro national picture. You know, it's not going to change the intergenerational elasticity by a whole lot if you're looking at income inequality. So I think it's going to be marginal. But then the other thing that you touch on is this issue of a kind of an educational arms race, right? Which, I mean, sociologists have been writing about this for a long time. There's a nice paper by a sociologist at Berkeley called Sam Lucas. He calls it, what's his term? Education, well, I've forgotten what his acronym is, but the idea is that as a given level of education becomes more accessible to a wider range of people, the people who before that more or less had exclusive access to that are then going to find other ways of distinguishing their children from the children who reach that level of education. So it's what you said, you know. So when I think about when I was at Yale, I mean, you know, it wasn't enough to get into Yale to have, like, you know, top marks in all your schoolwork and, you know, everything like that. You had to have set up I'm exaggerating, anyway, but you had to have set up, you know, an AIDS charity in Africa, and you had to have performed at Carnegie Hall, and you had to have done, you know, I mean, you had to have all these other accomplishments. And working class kids are not going to have that accomplishment, right? So, you know, it's going to be, I mean, of course they try to take that into account, but still, you know, middle class and upper middle class parents are going to find these ways of sort of trying to get around these things. So, and the other thing, of course, is that in some countries, when tertiary education has been expanded and opened up, what has happened is the advantages, so Sweden is a case in point here, what has happened is those extra places are not being taken by smart working class kids, they're being taken by the slightly less smart middle class kids who couldn't get in before, but now they do. So in a way, you could almost say that's a slightly regressive effect of expanding education. So, yeah, so that's been a kind of a rather long-winded answer to your question. But I think, you know, there's a lot of moving parts to this. But the bottom line is that you're going to get a bigger effect of investment in education when you're also seeing structural changes in the economy. Because, I mean, as we were saying before, I mean, you can invest in children in depressed parts of the country, you can invest in their education, but if they get a high education, they're just going to leave that in search of places where they can put that high education to use. You know. And so, if you think of the Irish case, for instance, that was very much the case, right? So, Ireland has got this long history of low-educated people migrating, but in the second half of the 20th century, it had a history of well-educated people migrating. But that stopped when, you know, they pursued this policy of encouraging inward investment. And when that became successful, then of course opportunities opened up in Ireland, and then you saw people staying at home and taking those opportunities. So, you know, so in that sense, the effect of education on inequality in Ireland was not really evident until you got that structural growth as well. So I think, you know, educational reform, educational changes, I mean, they're all extremely worthwhile things, but I think we shouldn't expect too much of them in terms of how they affect rates of intergenerational mobility.
Yeah.
Thanks. So our focus here tends to be on equipping leaders with ideas, analysis, and sort of helping them guide what they're going to do next. If I was looking at your data and I was sitting in the Riksdag in Sweden, who have sort of this national story of their incredible social mobility, welfare system, education system, I'd be pretty depressed that looking at America, who have the American dream, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it seems to be roughly the same story. What can policymakers do now, given the trend broadly looks the same across several different countries? Is it just a case of not allowing it to decline anymore, or are there opportunities to have another wave of social mobility increase?
Well, okay. Let me just say about the trend looking the same in the two countries. I mean, to the extent that it does look the same, I think it's been brought about in rather different ways, right? So I think in one of our earlier books we said there are different ways in which countries can get, high rates of mobility, and the Swedish way is one, and maybe the American way is a different one. They don't look so similar, of course, if you look at income mobility. Right? They do look similar in terms of class mobility, but if you think about the variation within classes in terms of incomes, it's going to be way greater in the US than it is going to be in Sweden. And particularly in after-tax incomes then. Right? There's less difference in pre-tax, but after-tax there's a huge difference. So I don't think we should say, that it's exactly the same. And of course, we stop at 1970, so we don't see these younger cohorts. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, that it may not be the same. But in terms of what one can then think about is, if you think about the Swedish-US case, one of the very interesting things is let's talk about income mobility now. Why is income mobility higher in Sweden than it is in the US? And the reason is that in Sweden, so in all income mobility studies, there's a lot of stickiness at the top and there's a lot of stickiness at the bottom. So people who are in top earning families, they tend to become top earners themselves, and people who are in very poor families, they tend to be low earners themselves. So that's a kind of a universal finding. But in Sweden and the US, the difference between the two is not at the top. So rich families in Sweden manage to hold on to what they have in terms of intergenerational mobility, just the same as American families. But at the bottom, Swedish families at the bottom, their children can move up much more than American families at the bottom. So I think if one were thinking about the policies that one would want to focus on, I think it would be those kind of policies. What is it that they're doing in Sweden that is helping those families to move up? And they're not doing it in the US. So I think that's one area in which one could think about looking at it. I mean, I suspect that one of the differences is the availability of steady, well-paid employment for these people who have relatively modest educational qualifications, right? I mean, by modest now, we're talking about they've probably completed secondary school, right? And that's the kind of thing that is lacking, as we all know. It's been declining in the US, right? It's been declining in lots of countries. But in Sweden, I mean, maybe those are the kinds of jobs that they are still, and then you start to think about, well, maybe those are jobs in the public sector, right? So these kind of structural openings are going to be available there in ways they're not available in the US. Of course, that's not the only solution, but I think that's part of it.
Thanks, Richard. I wondered if we could get into this a bit more, the kind of opportunities for this repeating at some point. Because I guess what you had in the post-war era, it was I was sort of thinking maybe three things going on. There's more space at the top in occupations. At the top, there's a shift in the structure of the economy from manufacturing dominated to service dominated. And also critically, there's massive productivity growth in the first 30 years post-war that then declines until the early 2000s, and now it's completely on the floor.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering which of those dynamics, and maybe there's something else, you think was most critical in causing the boom in social mobility? Because if it was productivity, that has both an upside and a downside. The upside is we could repeat it if we could get a tech revolution to, but also as a downside in the sense that things are looking pretty bleak right now. Because productivity is basically static. So I don't know whether that sparks any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I could really talk about how the effect of productivity growth might have been different to the effect of the sort of growing room at the top. I mean, I think what you said obviously makes a lot of sense, and I think if the productivity were to grow, then it would make available the kinds of jobs that might make it possible for people at the bottom, just as we were talking about a moment ago, to move up and get out of that, and get into kind of more stable forms of employment. But on the other hand, I suppose you've got to be cautious about that, right? Because, I mean, you don't really want to make an argument about what's going to happen to jobs just based on what's going to happen to productivity. I mean, in the sense that what happens to jobs has a lot to do with how labour markets are regulated. Right? So, I mean, if you had high productivity jobs, but you had a very unregulated labour market in which, I mean, imagine, if it's possible, high productivity, 0 hours contract kind of jobs, then that probably wouldn't have much of an effect, right? So, I mean, these things have got to be, they've got to be considered together. I mean, our argument is that the manufacturing to service move was really part of the more space at the top, right? And because that was essentially what was happening. But I mean, I think it.
Does that mean that if in the 21st century you're staying in services, it's service to services, you can't repeat that?
It's hard to see how you could repeat it on the scale at which it happened there, right? I mean, the 20th century was a time of continuous growth, really. And then it got this big boost after the Second World War, and then it sort of flattened out. So whether you can replicate, I don't think you can replicate the boost, but I mean, maybe more feasible to think about replicating the sort of slow growth of these things. Yeah, possibly, but I mean, I think I'm beginning to wander outside my field now, really. I mean, this is more something, I suppose, that, you know, economists would be able to talk about.
Speaking of
I tried very hard to avoid controversial things here. There you go. It just made me regret it. You spoke a lot of the things that you speak about, I feel, have like an unspoken other mechanism in them, which is sort of peer effects and social networks. So obviously a big part of space at the top and accessing the space at the top is obviously you get awesome seminars at Nuffield, but you also get to meet loads of people that will be really important later on in your life. And obviously we don't yet have a lot of very good ways at grasping how much of the effect of education is peer effects and how much is... Loads of cool people are doing loads of really good research on this at the moment, but we're still kind of like infantile stage of being able to separate the two. But do you think that there is a strong case for there being differences in mobility as a result of the ability of policy to disrupt the weightiness of social networks? So basically, for example, through apprenticeships, you're not just sort of giving an education to people, you're also introducing them into a world where they're meeting people that they would not have necessarily met having been from a working class background or not from like a background where social capital that they get from their connections is particularly useful when they go into the labour market.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting issue. I mean, this isn't something that we've looked at, right? The peer effects, but I mean, if you're thinking about sort of peer effects, you seem to be thinking about the peer effects at the sort of intersection between education and work, really, right? Which, I mean, I imagine that it's hard to get a handle on how important these things are, though. Right? I mean, I think quite... Oh, crikey, that's me. How embarrassing. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get a handle on how important these things are, right? I mean, I think we often tend to focus on things like internships and so on, and, you know, sort of connections that are made through Oxbridge, as in your example. But I mean, there we're talking about a fairly small share of occupations, right? We're talking about occupations right at the top, and we know that they're not very meritocratic in the sense that an awful lot of people who are in some of those occupations are from, example, private schools. So I think the occupational group that is the most private school dominated is the judiciary, I think, lawyers, journalists. If you look at a group that's at the top that is not private school dominated, CEOs. Right? So that's a much more meritocratic in that sense than these things like lawyers, doctors, and so on. So, I mean, I think then that these peer effects, they're going to be more important in some areas than in others. And so I'm not sure when we're talking about intergenerational mobility across the whole population how important they're going to be, right? If we're talking about somebody who is mobile, their parents are kind of unskilled workers. We want them to be mobile into some kind of skilled job or sort of better quality administrative work. Not sure that peer effects are the main thing that you would want to focus on for them. I can understand why if you wanted someone to become a lawyer, you might, if you were looking at people who become lawyers, you might there be very concerned about sort of peer effects and social network effects. So I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying that I think that sometimes when we think about intergenerational mobility, especially academics and journalists, they do tend to think about the things that they know about, which tends to be social mobility at the top rather than social mobility at the middle and the bottom. And so, The Guardian obsesses about Oxbridge, doesn't it? And I mean, it's important, of course. There's good reason why the elites of a society should reflect the composition of that society. But in terms of intergenerational mobility, it's only a very, very tiny fraction of what we're thinking about.
Hi, so in this literature there's the distinction, the role of education and mobility between equalisation or reduction of the OE association and expansion. So in fact the OD association is lower at high levels of education. I'm just wondering if this featured, you've looked at equalisation a lot, and I'm wondering if you compared the kind of substantive magnitude of this effect compared with expansion and educational returns, for instance, as well?
Well, we did actually. So in terms of what's driving all this, changes in educational returns don't themselves seem to be having a major direct impact. Though I think you could well argue that changes in educational returns had an impact in encouraging people to stay in education. So if you look at Golden and Katz's work on the race between education and technology on the US, I mean, they make a very strong case that what was driving educational expansion in the US was the incentive that came from the upgrading of the American occupational structure. In other words, people had more reason to want to stay on in education because there were better jobs available. And that kind of fits our work as well. But in terms of the role of expansion more directly, I mean, it is quite well known, I think, that at least in terms of class mobility, people who have a degree, their social origin has less of an effect on where they end up than people who are less highly educated. So social background seems to matter more if you have lower levels of education than if you have higher levels of education. And so you do see this phenomenon in a lot of countries. It's not really clear why it comes about. I mean, it could be because those kinds of labour markets are more meritocratic than labour markets for less educated people. Or it could simply be a selection effect. It could be that there is a difference between people, but it's not evident in their education. They're being the kind of people who are being selected into this is what's driving it. Though the selection effects would argue that this relationship would diminish as more and more people got into higher education, and it doesn't. So it doesn't. Maybe it's not a selection effect. Maybe those labour markets are more meritocratic. So in some countries, this seems to have played a big role. In the US, actually, equalisation of education was not really very important because it didn't equalise that much. You may not have noticed, but I think in the OE figure, the line for men is more or less flat in the US. But expansion had a big effect in the US. So it has been very important. I think what we know now, though, is that saying that social origins are less important for people with high levels of education, we have to be a little bit more careful about this now, because the work of the people at LSE has certainly shown that for people who get into the top classes, it's the top class, isn't it? I think it's just the first class in NSSEC. Social origins then are related to differences in earnings within those classes. So, it's not that social background doesn't matter at all, but it certainly seems to matter less at that level than it does at earlier levels, though there may be exceptions in certain occupations where it still continues to matter. Again, it's quite difficult to disentangle this from selection effects, because, you know, if you're saying, okay, we say we take everybody with a degree, and then we see that among those people, those from better off background, higher class backgrounds earn more. I mean, that may be because it's picking up differences which it would be legitimate to reward. Right? It may be that they have other things which are not captured in the measure of education. On the other hand, it may not. It may be straightforward discrimination. That, I mean, and we do know that this happens. I mean, so in the US, there's been a lot of work, especially by a sociologist called Lauren Rivera, who looks at how elite companies choose who to recruit. And her work shows that, you know, so she looks particularly at Wall Street banks. And it's very much the case that it's not enough to have gone to Yale or Harvard or Princeton. You also have to have all these kind of social skills as well. So, you know, you have to summer in the Hamptons. You have to know how to play polo, or at least ride a horse, you know. You have to know all about European art. You know, I mean, if you don't know those things, it doesn't matter how good your degree is from Harvard. You're not going to get a job with Goldman Sachs. So, you know, that would be a way in which these social origin differences are going to manifest themselves then in differences even between people who have the same, not just the same level of educational qualifications, but an educational qualification from an elite university. But again, of course, we may only be looking at a small fraction of what's going on, right? As I was saying in my earlier reply, we think about these things a lot, but numerically, you know, how many people are working for Wall Street banks in the US? I mean, what proportion of a birth cohort graduates from Harvard, Yale, or Princeton in a given year? Well, I think the total graduation from those three universities is probably no more than 6,000 people every year. That's 6,000 people in a population of 370 million. So, you know, it's important, but it's important to get in perspective. It's not that numerically.
May I have time for one more
yeah.
question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about what I mean, you kind of pulled on it then, but the role of employers in kind of intergenerational fluidity and the strength between origins and destinations, because maybe this is kind of a curse of my generation, where more of us are going to go to tertiary education. But say, for instance, if intergenerational fluidity hinges on that kind of, let's say, 5-year gap after you graduate, where depending on how saturated the graduate labour market is, then would you not be more inclined to see a strengthening of the relationship between origins and destinations, because people are more likely to pull on nepotistic levers of their parents? And it's not just, you know, their parents getting them jobs, it's actually often getting internships that are that distinguishing factor on their CVs, irrespective of whether they've gone to Harvard, Princeton or Yale and they're applying to banks or something. It's not necessarily that it's social skills as well, but is there not also a role for employers to say, you know, if every piece of work experience on somebody's CV, how did you get this? Did you apply for it meritocratically, or were you given it by a friend of a friend, no, your parents' friend, and because they had a contact in this bank or something like that? Do you agree that there is a stronger role in employment culture, especially within an increasingly saturated graduate market, to increase intergenerational fluidity?
Well, of course, I mean, I think employers are obviously they're the gatekeepers to the occupation. So, I mean, they're playing a crucial role, right? So, I mean, if they are, I mean, ideally what employers should be doing is they should be using those signals from potential employees which are most closely related to the productivity that those people will bring as employees when they're hired, right? So, in a way, what we want to remove is all those benefits to getting into, all those things that improve your chances of getting into a job that are not related to the productivity that you will demonstrate when you're in that job. Yeah. So to the extent that some of the things that you're talking about are not going to be related to productivity, then of course it's illegitimate for employers to use those as a yardstick. But of course it's very hard to draw that line. right? So, you know, when I know Goldman Sachs is saying we want someone who can talk knowledgeably about the modern art market, you might think, well, that's why. Well, because that's what their clients want to talk about, you know. So it looks like a non-meritocratic thing, but it is in fact a meritocratic thing. So, I mean, it's quite tricky to draw the line between these things. I mean, so obviously there are certain things where it's very clear, but other things, not so much. But I mean, your basic point is obviously true. But then I suppose the question is, how would you make employers behave in that way?
Yes, I agree. I do agree that the yardstick is increasingly difficult to draw, especially, like you say. Well, I mean, I used to work in a bank, and every single different team had a different purpose, and it would have required different skills. And obviously, depending on your upbringing, you would have had certain skills that would have lent you more applicability. But do you think policymakers in general don't focus enough on the employment side of it, or do you think there is a reasonable emphasis on it? Because whenever I look at social mobility, it's often through the lens of education and access to tertiary education, but like you said, it's not necessarily indicative of people moving to be. In terms of actual policymakers' emphasis on how employers can act on this, do you think it's relatively proportionate?
I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure that I can say really what policymakers think about this, because I haven't talked to any of them about it. So I mean, I'm not specifically a policy person, so I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that. But I mean, I would be surprised if they hadn't thought about this, right?
Okay, we should probably bring this to a close. We can always carry on talking, but thanks so much, Richard Breen.
Okay.
We should bring this to a close, but thank you very much, Professor Breen, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye-bye.